Seja bem-vindo, esta é mais uma produção da sua videoteca digital para a revista Implante Newsperio dentro do nosso programa de crescimento profissional. O nosso convidado de hoje é o professor Lyndon Cooper. O professor Cooper é reitor associado para pesquisa e diretor do Departamento de Biologia Oral na Faculdade de Odontologia da Universidade de Illinois, em Chicago, Estados Unidos. Professor de Odontologia Stallings, com distinção e diretor em pós-graduação em prótese pela Universidade da Carolina do Norte, Chapel Hill. Também ele é diplomado pelo American Board of Prosthodontics, tem prêmio de médico pesquisador da Academia de Prótese, tem prêmio de cientista notável pelo IEDR para prótese e implantodontia e também é o ganhador do prêmio Schweitzer de pesquisa em prótese do GNIAP. Ok. Dr. Cooper, first, many thanks. Thank you very much for coming to this Congress. Thank you. Many thanks.
Dr. Rossetti, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be in Brazil again.
The pleasure is all mine. Okay. Wow, this is an amazing background, I have to say. Amazing background. First, tell us about your background in dentistry and research.
You know, like many young people, I went to dental school to become a dentist. And along the way, I realized that the questions that we had no answers to were more interesting than the problems that I had solutions for. And over the time of leaving dental school and spending time in a hospital residency program, the U.S. government created a program for training dental scientists. I was fortunate enough at the University of Rochester Medical Center to be able to pursue both formal prosthodontic training as well as a PhD in biochemistry. Just when you think you're ready to leave and become an academician or a scientist, I found another opportunity to go to the National Institutes of Health, where for a period of 2 years I left behind clinical dentistry completely and focused only on science. That was very important, to be able to work 70, 80, 90 hours a week in a laboratory without any patient concerns. That provided a very strong foundation. I have made lifelong friends at the NIH who inspired me to be a better scientist. Eventually, I found myself at the University of North Carolina, where I set a goal for myself to become not only a bench scientist, but a clinical scientist. And over the years, the last 26, 27 years, we've been able to pursue both fundamental basic research, sometimes related to dentistry, most times related to dentistry, other times not, and clinical science, looking at problems typically related to dental implant therapy. And so for 25, 26, 27 years, I've continued to address questions related to implant therapy.
Oh my God, this is a splendid background. I hope every clinician could have that chance that you have to investigate things, because I imagine it's very important to understand how a bone cell works and what happens. What is the importance of understanding bone cell mechanisms for clinical outcomes?
It's interesting you say that, because I often tell my students when I'm teaching implant surgery that when I make an incision, I don't see the blood or the knife. In my brain, I see the cells talking to one another. And I think about it very differently. And when I'm closing a flap with a suture, I don't necessarily see the sutures. I see the tissue coming together, and I think about what's happening tomorrow, the formation of a blood clot, and the superimposition into the blood clot of early inflammatory cells. And I think about how those cells are responding to what I have done as a surgeon. And then I step back and think about who is the patient, and what is their systemic biology, and how does their current comorbid disease influence the behavior of the cells in that little space that I've just created with my suture. I don't know if it makes me a better surgeon or a better prosthodontist, or it makes me a worse surgeon or a worse prosthodontist, but it certainly is a very unique way of looking at the problem. I think everything we do in dentistry is intervening with biology, whether it's brushing our teeth or pulling a tooth or placing an implant. And each time we intervene with biology, we have to ask ourselves some fundamental questions. For me, those questions are, what are those cells doing now?
Do you think that our colleagues start to become more interested in implant dentistry when we start to see different implant surfaces? Do you think this was the turning point?
You know, in 1994, I had the opportunity as a very young investigator to stand on an international podium and talk about implant surfaces. And this was the very beginning. In fact, there was only one company selling a rough-surfaced implant in the United States, and I happened to be very interested in this. And there was a very strong appreciation for the fact that implants did not succeed in low-density bone, and implants did not succeed long-term in some patients. Today, in 2017, we see almost all implant surfaces are modified. We call them moderately rough surfaces. I don't think the community appreciates just how important this technology was, and I don't think they appreciate that while we see these surfaces work well, perhaps we don't appreciate truly what they do for us. It's an example, well, I'll give you an example in our own world. We developed with industry a new surface, and it turned out that the surface worked through nanotechnology. Perhaps it wasn't the intent to create a surface with nanotechnology or nanoscale modification, but it was revealed that perhaps that was the mechanism by which the surface could work. Looking at what we have done in dentistry, this might be the first example where a clinician has harnessed nanotechnology to change the behavior of a human cell. And I think when we use these types of surfaces, and there are not too many in dentistry, this third generation of implant surfaces, when we use nanotechnology on a third generation implant surface, we actually are informing the cells to do something different. And we know from our human research that those surfaces inform cells to create more bone more rapidly. And for many patients, this could be the difference between implant success and implant failure. Today, our laboratory is moving beyond the bone and into the mucosa. And we're very interested in how abutment surface technology could modify the behavior of epithelium. And we have data that we will publish this year that says if you change the surface of an abutment, you can alter the performance of the epithelium attaching to the implant's abutment surface. So this strategy of using technology to alter the way the body behaves in a local area remains very interesting to me.
Because I remember to read a lot of articles talking about bone biology and all those investigation technologies like DNA hybridization checkboard or something like new things on the block, different bond proteins, things like the whole of the genetics and different types of investigations. So also scientific communication to a dental colleague, that's not. How do you?
This is a challenge for all of us. As a scientist, for example, I have to be able to communicate with someone who is not a dentist. But to be valued in the community, I have to be able to teach the dentist what's important. I think we should go back and remember that 1965 was a very interesting year. It was the year that Marshall Urist coined the term BMP, and every dentist knows what BMP is. Yeah. But do they really know how it works? Yeah. Well, in 1965, Marshall Urist had this potential in BMP. He didn't know how it worked. It was only 1958 when Watson and Crick discovered DNA structure. And by 1965, there was no such thing as a transcription factor or cloning. At that same time, Dr. P.I. Brånemark had just begun his very first initial studies of implanting implants in humans. When he envisioned the endosseous implant, in fact, when he published his first reports in the late 1970s, there had still been no understanding of DNA cloning. We did not understand what a transcription factor was. We had only recently discovered some of the first non-collagenous proteins of bone. By the time dental implants reached the United States in the 1980s, we had begun to explore the biology of cells. We had begun to understand bone physiology. And it's very interesting that for the better of dentistry, many dentists have kept up in the field. In fact, going back to the surface technology, many surfaces are introduced to dentistry and for dental implants. Most of them can be patented based on the way they are manufactured. And I would argue that there are probably many different ways to create a surface that is very similar. And so many companies have very many different surfaces. In developing a surface for the use of a dental implant, I believe many companies ask, how can we modify a surface? We worked with industry to ask a very different question, and it was based on the molecular biology of bone. You see, in bone there are only two regulatory molecules that take a stem cell and tell it to become a bone cell. We surmised, or we believed, that a strong surface, a good surface, would be able to turn those two switches on in a bone cell. And if the surface could turn those two switches on in a bone cell, then when the implant is placed in bone, the stem cells would become bone-forming cells. So we developed an entire program around studying those two switches. And when it became time to evaluate and build a new surface, we didn't ask what surface works. We asked, how do we build a surface to turn on those two switches? And what's interesting is we're still studying it today. How does a surface turn on that switch? But we use those switches as identifying factors in building surface. And so we know that the surface we help to develop actually does that work. The sad part is, if you look out across the exhibition hall, most of the companies have no data on the surfaces that they sell. Fortunately for our patients, most of the moderately rough surfaces have proven to have some benefit. So we continue to ask the question, how much biology should a dentist know? How do we give them that knowledge? I think dentists should be responsible for knowing how the products they use work, and we'll continue to try to teach them.
My next question is about bone-to-implant contact, because there's no such thing to say my system has more bone to implant contact than your system. And sometimes, what's the point about this?
It's interesting. When, again, people like Andre Schroeder and P.I. Brånemark envisioned osseointegration, there was the notion that there must be direct bone-to-implant contact. Neither Dr. Schroeder nor Dr. Brånemark ever envisioned that bone-to-implant contact would be 100%. In fact, it begets another question that maybe we'll get to.
Okay.
But ultimately, the question you ask is, how much is enough bone-to-implant contact? We don't know, do we? But there are a couple papers that were reporting on studies done in the mid-1990s that inform us as to what might be enough bone-to-implant contact. They were studies that compared machined implants to rough surface implants. One of them I'm very familiar with, Carl Johan Ivanov, published this work using the surface you don't have in Brazil, which is the old Tioblast surface, compared to machined.
Okay.
And they placed these in posterior maxilla, and they placed them in posterior mandible, basically type 4 bone. And what was most interesting is what they found was on machined implant surfaces, there was only 9 or 10% bone-to-implant contact after 6 months of healing. But on rough surface tile-blast implants, there was 30 to 40% bone-to-implant contact. An identically organized study was performed by Richard Lazzara using his OsseoTite surface compared to machine surfaces, and they found essentially the same result. Now, while they didn't look at the success of those implants, they demonstrated one thing, that a machined implant in type 4 bone possesses approximately 10% bone-to-implant contact, while a rough surfaced implant can generate much more bone-to-implant contact. What we knew at the time was we had a high failure rate of implants in type 4 bone. Now, going forward, if you look into the mid-2000s, 2004, 2005, people like Torsten Jent at the Brånemark Clinic began to look at the outcomes of implants in the maxilla. And what Torsten Jent found was when he looked at a cohort of patients who he treated with the old machine type 2, type 3 Brånemark implant versus the newer moderately rough Nobel implant, they found that there was an increased percentage of success or a reduction in implant failure in type 4 bone when using a moderately rough implant. Based on that information, one might argue that for peace of mind, an implant that can generate 30 to 40% bone-to-implant contact is a good idea.
Good idea.
One other point about bone-to-implant contact is I think it changes over the lifetime of the individual. That it's not the bone that's formed in the first 6 months will not be the bone that's there 20 years later. And Dr. Albrechtsen, Thomas Albrechtsen, once wrote a paper on a retrieval analysis that showed that we continue to gain bone at well-functioning implants. So it may be important to think about how the implant performs over a lifetime. What we also must remember is that short-term studies in dogs don't reflect a lifetime of care in a human being. And so the bone-to-implant contact that you have in your 25-year-old healthy patient may not be the same bone-to-implant contact they possess when they're 60 years old and taking many medications and have many diseases. We don't know anything about how that changes longitudinally. Great question. I'm sorry I don't have a good answer.
Well, now let's talk about prosthodontics.
Sure.
Okay? Sure. So, but first, let's talk about your moving from North Carolina to Chicago. What has changed?
My role. In North Carolina, I was responsible for running an entire department, as well as a graduate program, and then more focused only on the graduate program. And running a graduate program was perhaps for me the most rewarding personal job I've ever had, being with the students every day. But things change and opportunities present themselves, and I was asked to lead the research efforts at the University of Chicago. So now, instead of focusing on the residents and their training as young clinicians in a specialty, the mentorship I provided to young students in developing their skills as clinicians has now been turned to the mentorship of young scientists and their development as researchers. And so it's still highly engaged, person-to-person contact, much more responsibility for the budgets of research in an institution, but still the same commitment to making sure that our dental schools are acting as true professional schools, and that is the generation of new knowledge and dissemination of new knowledge to the next generation of clinician scholars.
What's the budget now?
It's big. Our dental school budgets, in any dental school in the United States are tens of millions of dollars. So
per year?
Yes. So in Chicago, I think our budget is someplace north of $50 million per year. Some dental school budgets are larger than $100 million per year. And dental schools have the challenge of being financially solvent. It's quite a challenge. Dental school education, as you know, is the most expensive education in any university. One of our challenges that we continue to address is having sufficient funds for research, being able to hire highly talented, innovative, aggressive, and forward-thinking scientists. And one of my jobs is to make sure that we continue to create an environment where scientists can work efficiently and effectively. They can encourage the participation of talented students and talented young scientists, and to provide them with the resources necessary to do their work.
And did the students of today are more interested or less interested in doing research? What do you think about it?
I don't think it's changed. I think there are only a certain percentage of people who we find in dental schools who are actually interested in research. For me, as I said before, I went to dental school with the intentions of being a dentist. So it changed dramatically for me when I learned about dentistry. We see that. But we also see remarkably talented people come specifically for research. I want to take a minute and be very proud, or almost boastful, of our program at Chicago. Our university has a program that trains students both in dentistry and their PhD science at the same time. We call this MOST. So this is a multidisciplinary oral sciences training program, or MOST. This program recruits students from all over the country, and the students who apply to this program are the most talented, intelligent people I have ever seen. And our challenge is to select one or two every year.
Just one?
Yeah.
Wow.
And so in this program now we have at one time between 7 and 10 people being trained in their first, second, third, fourth year of dental school, as well as somewhere in their first, second, third, or fourth year of their PhD. And these people are doing remarkably well. And I think they represent the next generation of scholars. For us, the challenge will be to have them graduate successfully with both their dental degree and their PhD degree, and to spend more time reinforcing their science skills so they can go on to be independent, successful investigators in a dental school. So far, so good. But it's something that I think our institution at Chicago does as well, if not better, than any school in the United States. Perhaps we've established something that's truly unique in the world.
Well, congratulations.
Well, thank you. You know, we also offer remarkable opportunities internationally. Dean Stanford, Clark Stanford, dear friend and someone who I admire greatly, has gone around the world and has started establishing formal relationships with other institutions. And we bring students from all over the world to our school for formal PhD training. In fact, you know, in my own laboratory, we're hoping that Brazilian students will again come. I've trained remarkable people from Brazil, two of which are really fabulous and dear friends now, Dr. Gustavo Mendonça and his wife Daniela.
Great guy.
They are terrific, and they're now at the University of Michigan. It's unfortunate we had to part ways when we all left North Carolina, but that's an example of how you know, international opportunities exist. And Chicago's a great place for that.
Wow. Well, okay, let's talk about prosthodontics. My first question is about obviously zirconia, monolithic zirconia. What's the point now? In which path you see the technology?
You know, if we didn't have CAD/CAM, we wouldn't have zirconia. And I also believe if we didn't have zirconia, people wouldn't be terribly interested in CAD/CAM because zirconia is relatively inexpensive. And so the commercial laboratory, who doesn't make these large, beautiful prostheses, but spends the majority of their time making a single crown, they have a remarkable profit margin. The cost of material in a single crown is low, the computers work better, the mills work better, and they can make a pretty white tooth at a very low price for a dentist and their patient. I'm not inspired by only that part of zirconia. I think zirconia at the present time represents, for the large dental prosthesis supported by implants, one of the only choices we have. As I mentioned in my lecture yesterday, the problems that we have with large dental prosthesis are not going away. The chipping, the breaking, the fracture that occurs with metal ceramics, the fact that cast alloys do not fit, they simply have never fit, the fact that things made of acrylic wear, and then moving to milled frameworks out of zirconia. We have a chipping problem with the veneered porcelain. And then if we mill a framework out of cobalt chrome and apply porcelain to that, we have the same chipping problem. Moving to monolithic zirconia with little or no veneering material removes the problem of chipping. And I think this is important. The other is they fit remarkably well. The third point is, as we move to the next generation of intraoral scanning, I think we'll find that intraoral scans may become accurate enough to produce a cross-arch prosthesis. And I'll also say that I think we'll continue to see innovation in material and milling and actually additive printing technology in ceramics. For the time being, if I had to choose, I would choose, irrespective of the cost, monolithic zirconia, or, which we don't have time to talk about and haven't had time to talk about, milled methyl methacrylates. Because the new milled polymethyl methacrylates are very different materials than processed methyl methacrylates. So there's a lot of opportunity. What we unfortunately have is a rate of acquiring new technology that is so rapid that we are imposing new ideas in our patient care without substantial outcome measures. I'm confident, based on the work we've done in small groups, that these new technologies are not harmful. But I cannot tell you if they're substantially better than old technologies. They're certainly much better looking.
For sure.
They fit better, but will they last longer? I don't know. So as a clinician, not a scientist, not a researcher, as a clinician, I just tell my patients, this is the best I have to offer today, and tomorrow I will be here on a fee-for-service basis to fix your problem. I will be here for you.
Okay, let's talk about the new thing, mucosa, the material for implant abutments.
Yeah, so as you know, all of a sudden we have a new disease, peri-implantitis. And as you well know, for many, many years, people believed that the dental implant was immune from these problems. And people incorrectly still believe one should not probe an implant and one should just let it sit there. But the fact is that not all implants survive. Implants are subject to biofilm-mediated disease. Implants are subject to damage caused by cement in the mucosa. And from what we understand, most of these disorders or diseases begin in the mucosa. So the question becomes, what is the condition of the mucosa through which the abutment passes? You see, if an implant were buried in the bone and did not have a communication to the oral cavity, it could last forever, perhaps, without infection, without loss of bone. It could remain integrated. So the real issue is, what is the condition of the epithelial attachment that exists on the abutment? Currently, much of the research is focused on inflammatory cytokine mediators that are actually produced by the connective tissue. That research is important, that research is good, but there's been a complete absence of investigation about the role of epithelium in its interaction with the abutment. I bring this up because if you look phylogenetically across evolution and species, the role of epithelium is to protect the underlying body. And we know that the genes that are encoded in the keratinized epithelium are some of the oldest genes that exist in vertebrates. Therefore, the function of those genes, the protective functions of structural genes and genes secreted by epithelium, are probably important to the function of the epithelium surrounding an abutment. So we have slowly begun to study what happens when one changes the structure of an abutment surface in the context of epithelium. And the very brief answer is, if you change the topography of the abutment, if you look very carefully, you see dramatic changes in the structure of the epithelium. We will also publish work this year in the field of peri-implantitis that shows that in peri-implantitis, the remarkable changes are not the cytokines that everyone is studying. The remarkable changes are the structural and protective proteins produced by the epithelium. So we're very interested. But but we don't know much.
Okay. Well, Dr. Cooper, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much for this interview. I have enjoyed a lot. Thank you very much.
I've enjoyed my stay here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Este foi mais um vídeo da sua videoteca digital para a revista Implante Newsperio, pertencente ao programa de crescimento profissional. Muito obrigado e até a próxima.